All right, guys. So we're live with another study session. This time I'm going to be talking about Mexico and political violence. Remember, your test is coming up on Tuesday of this week. That's the 24th of April. So a couple of things before we get started. I do have some requests for things that you guys want me to talk about coming in. If you do use the live chat, I've also got that up. I can see if you're chatting on there. So feel free to ask questions that way as well. But a couple of things before I get started. First of all, I hope if you went to prom, you had a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful time. It was really beautiful out yesterday. I hope you got some good pictures. I hope you didn't obsess about them, but I hope you got some good pictures. And yeah, I hope it went well for you guys. I hope there wasn't a lot of drama. There's always drama with prom, but I hope yours was fine. And the other thing that I wanted to bring up is I had a couple of questions last week about registering for to vote and some other stuff like that. Like what's the deal with the primary that's coming up, and what is involved in all of that. So I actually spent a bit of time yesterday kind of going through and writing up a fairly extensive blog post for you guys on how to register to vote, and also how the primary system works in Georgia, what offices are up for election this time, and where you can find resources with regards to those sort of things. So give me half a second, because I do want to share my screen with you guys on that one. Yeah, hang on a second. Let me pull it up here. Where's my tool? Control room. That's not what I want. Cameraman. No, not what I want. Screen share. That's what I want. Okay, so screen share. So for a second, it's going to get really creepy. There we go. All right. So this right here, obviously, is the class blog. But if you scroll down, it's going to be the second entry now, not the first one, because the first one is the link to this particular, this particular study session. But if you scroll down a little, excuse me, I'm so sorry. I spent part of the day outside dealing with my plants and everything, and I think the pollen's getting to me. But regardless, so if you scroll down and you look at this blog post that I did, it talks primarily about how you register to vote, what constitutes eligibility, and I've tried to be as specific as I can. One thing I will point out for you guys, however, is that tomorrow and hopefully on Tuesday, we'll see if it works, but hopefully tomorrow during all lunches in the main cafe, we'll be signing people up to vote. You do need a state-issued ID, like a driver's license, and you need to know the last 4 digits of your social. If you have those 2 things, we can register you to vote. So if you are interested in finding out whether or not you're eligible to vote, go ahead, read through this. It also, if you scroll further down, it talks a little bit about, hang on, that's still on eligibility and walking you through how to do it. There's a section on upcoming elections, and it'll show you where you can find out every year, all the time, where what new elections are coming up, and when you have to be registered to vote for each of those elections. Now, obviously, once you're registered to vote, you don't need to re-register, but if you are not 18 yet, this might be relevant to you. So the general election coming up in November is going to be on November 6th. So for that one, you have to be registered to vote by October 9th. So if you're not eligible to vote in this primary, then the next big election coming up is the November one. So you do need to be registered to vote by October 9th. So I also go through and I've told you a little bit about what a primary is, how it works in this state, and all of the offices that are available for election this year. So I've gone through and I've tried to figure out which ones are specific to Cobb County, and hopefully that proves to be pretty useful for you guys. So I did take some time to read it. If you think it's useful for other people, not just you, feel free to share it around. I really do want you guys to be able to take advantage of your eligibility to vote. So please take care of that. That having been said, let me kind of jump on into the requests that I have in terms of things you guys want me to talk about. So give me half a second and let me pull things up here. Should have pulled this up on my iPad earlier. Whatever, I've got it on my desktop, so I'll just do it that way. Okay, so let's see here. First major questions I have. I'm going to address Caitlin. So Caitlin has a couple of questions here, and I'm going to do them one at a time. Caitlin wants to know what the difference is for an individual explanation, ideational explanation, and institutional explanation. And this is all pertaining to explanations for political violence. So this is the very first part of the unit that we talked about when we were discussing political violence. So hang on half a second, let me get a drink. Okay. So the first thing I would remind you of is that first and foremost, it's always important to remember that when we talk about these explanations, we are not just talking about something that that operates independently of anything else. So it's almost impossible for us to talk about, say, like, for reason I can't find the in a second. We really cannot talk very much about, say, like only individual explanations or only ideational explanations or something like that. Generally speaking, we can talk about those sort of things in concert. It's really a matter of more than one thing happening at a time, okay? So, hi, Andrew, I can see you. Okay, I'm sorry, it was taking me a moment to pull this one up, so hang on. All right. So yeah. So Caitlin, your question here: what's the difference between an individual, ideational, and institutional explanation for political violence? Okay. So we'll start with the most sort of broad and universal explanation before getting down to the most particularistic. So an institutional explanation of violence is when you look at something and you say that the institutional patterns that exist, like say a voting structure, are going to lead someone towards political violence, that the way an institution is set up, that it narrows people's ability to express themselves politically, and therefore is much more likely to result in political violence. So if you want some examples of that. Okay, so first of all, you could look at things like institutional racism is clearly something that can do that, where people feel that their ability to participate in the general system, be it in terms of governance or economic production, may be limited by the systems of inequality that are put into place in society and into political systems as well. All of those things can be part and parcel of something that essentially is whatchamacallit, I'm blanking on it, that limits your political efficacy in other forms. Okay. Okay. I'm sorry you can't type into the chat, Allie. I can see it just fine on Remind though, so feel free to ask questions there and we're fine. Okay. So when we're talking about institutional explanations for political violence, think about the documentary that we watched at the very beginning of this unit, Our Brand is Crisis, and remember their political system and their electoral system, right? So in their electoral system, the way it was set up was for it to be an SMD system with a presidential vote that didn't have a runoff, right? And they had something like 11 candidates running. And so the president won with 22.5% of the vote, which is in no way, shape, or form anywhere near a majority. I mean, it's a plurality, but it's a really narrow one because the next vote down was like 21%. So in that case, what you have is a political system that tends to devalue sort of majority opinion and make people feel that their vote doesn't matter. And in that regard, it makes political violence more likely because the democracy that is in place isn't really an expression of people's, like the general will of the people. It would be better probably if they had a two-round system with a runoff, right? So in that regard, an institutional explanation is like a good fit for why there were riots and why the president had to step down afterwards, okay? So that's an institutional explanation for political violence. Second major explanation would be ideational. So an ideational explanation is where we look at it and we say, okay, so what's the activating, say, like philosophy or belief system that is pushing a person towards a particular violent political act. So you could say that someone who adheres to a strict Marxist-Leninist sort of dogma or reading of the patterns of history might be more inclined to bring about sort of a violent political change because they believe that everything about the superstructure and the base must be torn down in order to move on to this new political reality, right? Or you could talk about it in the context of, say, a radical form of terroristic thought that basically makes the argument that the entire system is corrupt, like nihilism, that there is no meaning except through violence, and that can be the activating thing that pushes someone in towards political violence. In that regard, ideational explanations can be built upon institutional ones, that you can have existing institutions. If we go with like a Marxist-Leninist explanation, we could do something like saying, well, if you have a institution of industrial capitalism, which is exploiting poor people, and then people are exposed to the ideational sort of structure of Marxist-Leninist thought, then you're likely to see people engage in political violence. Okay, the individual explanation has kind of two wings. All right, so an individual explanation is all about personal choice, me choosing to enact violence or you choosing to enact violence. And in that regard, what we're looking at here is either sort of a psychological motivator or we're looking at rational choice. Okay, but regardless, we are looking at essentially expressions of free will. People who really are interested in looking at, say, the psychological motivations for why people engage in political violence, generally speaking, are looking at things like violence as an act of desperation, that violence is an attempt to restore meaning to a life that doesn't have any or doesn't seem to have any. This frequently uses the explanation of relative deprivation theory, right? So relative deprivation theory is really important in this unit and in a couple of other ones that we've done so far, and I really do want you to remember it. So relative deprivation theory, remember, is where your expectations for what you think you should have do not match your reality. And so like those expectations don't even have to be that extreme. Like you don't have to think that you should be a billionaire and you're only a millionaire, although sometimes that does happen. So relative deprivation theory is, I think I should be able to feed my family and I can't, and that makes me mad, and now I'm going to engage in political violence. So in that regard, like that's an individual explanation focusing on sort of like the psychological motivating factors. Then we also have people who look at it from the degree of, say, individual factors that motivate people towards violence that are based not on, say, acts of desperation, but rather as fully rational choices, where they are making perhaps abhorrent choices, but ones that are based on a systematic way of thinking, a set of worldviews and values, and based on those worldviews and values, their decisions make rational sense. So all of those explanations tend to be used to explain political violence. And it kind of depends as to who we're talking about, where we're talking about this violence, and also, generally speaking, what level of violence and in some regard, how sympathetic we are to it, as to what explanations we tend to kind of go with. Generally speaking, an institutional explanation has the least free will associated with it. It has this notion of sort of almost determinism, that the institutions push you in a direction. It's like path dependence, that you don't have to choose violence, but when you have limited options, eventually you're gonna probably get there. Whereas ideational, it requires like the ideas and the belief system set up the structure, but it takes a person to actually activate it. Whereas individual explanations is all about individual choices. So Caitlin, I hope that helps. Let me check in and see what other questions are popping up. So let's see here. Okay, so Andrew, let me know if you have any questions over there on the live chat, and I'll jump right on in. Otherwise, let's see here. I'm going to jump over to B-Day in Remind here. It looks like, okay, looks like Oni has a question. So actually, she sent it out. There we go. She sent it out on Friday. Thank you so much for doing that in advance, Oni. I really appreciate it. So Oni has a question. She wants to know about gubernatorial removal. Okay, so first and foremost, gubernatorial is one of my very favorite words because it's just a fancy way of saying things relating to governors, but gubernatorial, right? Hang on, let me get a sip of water here. Okay, so gubernatorial removals. In Mexico, there is a weird thing in the Constitution that allows for executive and federal oversight to state governors, which is not at all how anything works here in the States. This is an example of how Mexico is a federal system, but is perhaps less federal than the US, in that there's a much stronger central state. And even though there are reserved powers for the state, for a long time, those reserved powers were not particularly well sort of actualized. That doesn't make sense, but they didn't actually use them very much. Okay, so the way this works is in Mexico, if a president wants, they can request the Senate to investigate whether or not a governor has been managing the rule of essentially law and order in their state. If they have failed to maintain law and order in their state, then they can be voted to be removed by the Senate, and then the president can appoint a new governor for that state. So this essentially is a degree of federal oversight to state authority. This is not anything that can happen in the United States. In the US, in order to remove a governor, it has to be initiated by the state legislature, it has to come from the bottom up, essentially, not from the top down. But this has been well used throughout Mexican history between 1917 and 1964, when this was officially instituted into the Mexican Constitution. This was done at least once a year. So yeah, you really couldn't get comfortable if you were a governor of a Mexican state. Since 1964, it's been used a little bit more restrainedly. So every president has used this power, by the way, since 1964, just perhaps not to that degree. So they have done things like removed one governor or up to three. Three is about the max anybody's done since 1964. But there's also been cases where they simply just kind of like threaten it and then the governor steps down. And that happens more frequently than an actual procedural removal now. So yeah, there you go. The executive branch of state governance is not very permanent in Mexico. And this is one way that the Mexican presidency can kind of demonstrate its power. So hopefully that helps, Oni. Let me kind of jump around and see what else. Let's see here. I'm going to stick to Class B for a minute here. Oh, okay. Hi, Jordan. Okay, so I've got several questions here from Jordan. I am going to actually bundle yours with one that Mackenzie had asked. Jordan wants to know, how does the Iranian Revolution play into the Mexican political economy? I'm assuming it has primarily to do with oil. And Mackenzie also asked, what does the Iranian Revolution have to do with like Mexico? We're not there yet. Iran's our next unit. We'll be getting there on Wednesday. But you're absolutely right. It has to do with oil. The Iranian Revolution happened in 1979, and the bottom fell out of the oil market in 1981, and those two things are connected. So basically, what happens is during the mid to late 70s, a lot of countries, because the oil boom was so extensive, really kind of doubled down on their extraction of oil. Now, obviously, they were working through OPEC, most of these countries, and that meant that they kind of like coordinated and tried not to flood the market too much. But you still have all of these developing nations that really are requiring a lot of oil wealth to get things done. So they are starting to send out more oil onto the market and into stockpiles than they really probably ought to in terms of like, you know, market share. And then what winds up happening is the Iranian Revolution occurs in 1979. And as a result of the Iranian Revolution, there is an embargo of sale of oil to the United States because of complicated stuff that we will get into shortly. But it has to do with hostages and the US Embassy and all sorts of fun things. And the US trying to overthrow their government. And yeah, we'll get there. So as a result of that, there's an oil embargo against the United States. Well, the US has its own oil reserves. And so what we did was we started drilling heavily because we had a domestic oil market that we needed to meet. And we started to release our strategic oil reserve into the markets so that we could meet our local demand. And what happened then was when the embargo was ended, the US was still flooding the market with its oil. Mexico and everybody else jumped back into the market. Way too much oil out there. Plus, because of the embargo, a lot of automotive companies and other companies have really worked to try and come up with more gas efficient vehicles. And so they weren't like those gas guzzling boats from the late 1970s anymore. I mean, they were still boats in comparison to today, but they were a lot more efficient. And so you didn't really need as much gas as you previously had. So the oil market tanks, falls off the cliff. And yeah, that did in Mexico's economy and basically caused them to have to default on their loans. It was a big problem. So hopefully that helps Jordan and Mackenzie. I hope that explains your question there. Let's see here. Ali, I'm going to get to you now. Okay. Let's see here. Oh, okay, there we go. I was confused as to what you were asking. All right, so Ali wants to know what is hierarchical structure, what is network structure, and why are they important? And hang on, I am going to pull this up so that I can show it to you. That's not where I want to go. Give me a second, guys. There we go. Okay. All right. So I'm going to pull this up so I can show it to you because I really do want you to actually see the images. So Ali, what you're asking about has to do with structure of terrorism cells. That's really what we're talking about here. So when we are talking about, and there's actually diagrams of this in your reading, but if you didn't do that part of the reading, I won't lie. I won't act surprised about it. Hang on a second. I'm going to have to switch over again so I can share the page with you. Okay. Nope. Keep hitting that. That's still not the right answer. Okay, so here we go. I'm going to screen share and you're going to see like telescoping views of everything. Okay. All right. So hang on a second. Can you please hide this? I don't want to see that. Okay. There we go. Okay, so this right here is a hierarchical structure for terrorism. And this is kind of like the old style structure for terrorist cells, where essentially, in a lot of ways, terrorist cells like mimicked the existing governmental structure. Okay, let me see here. Yeah, so essentially during this period, we're really talking from like the 1950s up to the late 1980s, early 1990s. Frankly, you could stretch it up to 2001. Al-Qaeda is a good example of something that really worked on a hierarchical sort of structure for a very, very long time, although it doesn't work that way now. But essentially what you have here is a terror cell that is working on a really narrow set of goals. Like, let's use the example of the IRA in Ireland, because that's probably a really good one for you guys to understand. So the IRA in Ireland's goal is really easy to understand. They want to overthrow the government of Northern Ireland and incorporate Northern Ireland into the Republic of Ireland and have a unified Ireland altogether. Like, that is their goal. Like, it is a very narrow, like, specific goal. It's not like overthrow the West, whatever the heck that means. It is actually a goal that like has political ends in mind. And because of that, because it has this narrow end goal in mind, ultimately what that means is that the people who are running the terror cell have to ultimately think about like the political reality of achieving their goal. Like, if they actually get what they want, they have to be in a position to actually govern. And that changes the way that these sort of terror cells operate, because, and I've got down here at the bottom, if you can see my cursor, I think you can, where it says structure influences strategy right here. Structure influences strategy is super important, because what that means is that, like, in this particular political system for a terror cell, you have the political elite, the people at the very top who are running things. You've got the bureaucracy, the fundraisers, and the propagandists, and the strategists, and everything. And then you have the foot soldiers who actually go out and blow themselves up right here. Okay, all of these people buy into political violence as acceptable because they're all in your organization. But if you are trying to ultimately seize political control over something, then you have a limiting factor to the degree of violence that you can enact. Because the fact is that you're not just working for your primary audience, the people in your organization. You're also working for a secondary audience, which is people outside of your organization. People who are like, you know what, I don't like the fact that the IRA uses car bombs, but I can totally see their point about a unified Ireland. That I can totally see their point is exactly what they want. They want you to be able to forget about the level of violence that they are enacting because they want their ultimate aim to sound reasonable. And that means that the violence that they enact has a limiting factor to what they can do without losing their secondary audience, which they absolutely need, if for nothing else, for fundraising. But when we talk about network structure, this is what we are talking about, this right here. Network structure is much more modern. This is very much post-2001, post-9/11. There is no permanent center in a network strategy terror cell. And this is what ISIS is, and this is what Boko Haram is, and this is what Al-Shabaab operates this way, Al-Qaeda in the Yemeni Peninsula. Like, this is what most modern terror cells operate off of now. Essentially, everything is amorphous. It's decentralized. The goals themselves don't necessarily have an end point. Like, what is it that ISIS wants? They want to recreate the caliphate. Well, what the heck does that mean? Because they've lost all their territory now. Like, so they're just against the West? Like, what does that mean? There's no end point. There's no, we're going to take this territory and create this thing. It's just sort of this amorphous rage. And because of that, it's really hard to chop the head off the snake. There's no permanent center. The ideologies are massive and in some ways supra-political. It's not just about trying to like create a particular political entity or change something they dislike. It's about like overthrowing the entire way of people live and think. That's massive. And it also means that the scale of violence increases because in this system, there is no secondary audience. Everybody is the enemy. Everyone is the enemy. If you're not in the system, you're against the system. And so the only limiting factor is the primary audience, the people who are participating, and that is not a limiting factor at all. So hopefully that explains hierarchical structure versus whatchamacallit. I don't want to stop that. Let's see here. Stop screen sharing. There we go. Okay. So hopefully that explains things, Ali. Let me know if it doesn't, because I know it can be a little bit confusing, but I think it really helps to kind of understand modern terror cells in that way. Let me see what other questions I have got. So let's see here. I'm going to jump back, I think, to Jordan. If I can find you again, Jordan, where are you? There you are. Okay. So Jordan wants to know, what is Article 59 and why is it important? Hang on half a second. Let me take a sip of water here. I'm so sorry. Oh, okay. All right. So, sorry, I was looking at someone else's thing from Remind here. Okay, so Article 59 is something that is tied up in essentially, my apologies, Benito Juárez's La Reforma. He's the first guy to really come up with this notion. So that actually predates the 1917 Constitution, but this will become the foundation of that particular article. So this notion, part of, remember Benito Juárez is prior to Porfirio Diaz. He's the guy who gets kicked out of office because of, well, because the French come in and put an Austrian on the throne in Mexico, because that's the thing that happened. But Benito Juárez is also an indigenous man. He is pretty anti-clerical. He is pretty like pro-science and pro-public education and all sorts of stuff. But one of the things that he makes a statement of is the Juárez Law. The Juárez Law basically says that all citizens of Mexico have equal representation before the law. That's what that says. And essentially what happens is the Juárez Law is then translated into Article 59, which says that all people, like, let me see if I can find the actual text of it for you so that it like makes sense. Oh no, I'm reading the wrong one. Yeah, no, Juarez Law is something else. I'm sorry, I'm screwing this up here for you. No, Article 59 is basically like you can't be reelected. My apologies. I don't know what I'm thinking about here. Yeah, so Article 59 basically says, let me pull that one up. Yeah, senators and deputies to the Congress of the Union cannot be reelected for the immediately following term. So you can be reelected on a term subsequent to that, but you can't be an incumbent. So there's basically like no incumbents in the Mexican political system. Everybody has to take a season off, basically. Yeah, but the Juarez Law gets incorporated into other stuff. I'm so sorry about that. My apologies. I'm confusing you guys. I don't intend to be. Let's see here. What other questions have I got? Let's see here. Let me skip back over to 8A classes. Oh, hi, Mackenzie. Okay, can I go over the Cristero Rebellion a bit? Sure, I'd love to go over the Cristero Revolt. Okay. So the Cristero Revolt is something that happens after the Mexican Revolution, which is deeply awkward because they were like pretty sure they were done fighting at that point. So basically, Mexican Revolution, remember, goes from 1910 to 1920. And the fighting doesn't end until after the Constitution is ratified, and partially because people think it doesn't go far enough. But the Constitution of 1917 is remarkably anti-clerical, remarkably anti-military in a lot of ways. Very pro-union, very, very leftist, very, very leftist for the day and age. And that made a lot of people deeply concerned, especially the provisions that were so stringently anti-clerical. So when I say things are anti-clerical, what I mean is that in Mexico, there is both a deep sort of fondness and reverence for the church on what it does on a local level, and a deep suspicion for it on a national one. The church was for a long time the most powerful institution in Mexican colonial history. And as such, it had all of the institutional abuses and privileges that you might expect of it. And so, especially during the 19th century, there was kind of an alliance between the church and the military. And that made a lot of people deeply uncomfortable. So when the revolution ended in 1920, but the Constitution being written in 1919, what a lot of the people who were involved in the revolution did was they wanted to specifically limit the power of the church. They did not want the church to be able to assist the military or anything like that. So a lot of the requirements about what personnel in the church could do and what land they could own and everything was very much addressed in the 1917 Constitution. So it made it illegal for the church to own any land whatsoever. It also made essentially all members of the clergy employees of the Mexican state, which meant that they could be fired by the Mexican state. That, by the way, the Mexican Revolution borrowed directly from the French Revolution because Robespierre did that. It also redistributed a lot of land from the church to the general public in the form of ejidos. It also prohibited the ability of people who were clergy to run for high office in Mexico. So it really did limit what the church could do in public life. It also established public education as solely the province of the state, not the church. And so it closed down a lot of religious schools. And people rightly felt that the church was under attack. And truly it was. The state was not having it. And as a result of this, what you have in, I'd have to double check the dates on this, it's like 1924, there's a series of revolts that occur in southern Mexico called the Cristero Revolt. And it ultimately destabilizes the sort of nascent regime that is developing after the Mexican Revolution. In some ways, the Cristero Revolt is the reason for the creation of the PRI. The PRI, the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, is created as a means of trying to institutionalize the ideas of the revolutions, the values of the revolution, which is distinctly anti-clerical, and to also to try and stabilize the state. You know, if you don't have different political factions, then maybe you won't have the push-pull factors that can result in another political sort of period of instability for Mexico. If the PRI can control everything, if they can just own the system, then there's no need for debate. So yeah, the Cristero Revolt, I would primarily know because it's an expression of resentment of anti-clericalism. And it's also one of the motivating factors for the creation of the PRI in 1929. Okay, so hopefully that helps. Let me see who else has got questions for me. Okay, let me jump back to Jordan because I think Jordan had a bunch more that I need to get to. Let's see here. Jordan wanted to know, when the PRI was created after the revolution, was it primarily created by rural people? No. Created by? No. Created to exploit? Yes. Okay. No, the people who created the PRI were primarily the Constitucionistas, who I will get to in just a moment, because I know you had another question about that one, Jordan. But primarily urban elites, people who were well educated, generally located in fairly large cities. However, these were people who benefited from a patron-client, I was going to say exploitational, but let's go with patron-client relationship with rural populations. Very paternalistic sort of notion. So the PRI was created essentially by politicians who did not want to see Mexico devolve into another series of civil wars, who really wanted to see Mexico start to pull together in terms of creating a state that could weather storms, because at that point it really could not. And in order to do that, it's sort of, in some ways, I would make a connection between the PRI's reliance on rural populations and Mao's reliance on rural populations. Like, that is a legitimate thing to tie together there. Remember, Mao basically made the argument that the strength of China was its rural peasantry, and so too did the PRI. The PRI is like, 80% of the population is rural, so clearly that's what we've got to kind of focus in on. Oh, good. Victoria has questions. Yay. Sorry, I'm just checking Twitter over here, and I've got a whole bunch, and I will get to. Okay. So yeah, at any rate, we have, I've totally lost my train of thought. Yeah. So the PRI basically is looking at, we have about 80% of the overall population being rural peasants. That's where our strength is. That's what we've got to build up. We can't control the system if we can't control the peasants. And to their credit, I mean, I look at it and I tend to think that there's a whole lot of exploitation going on, but it really was to some degree a reciprocal relationship, to some degree, because people did benefit from the PRI system up into a point. They did see, electrification. They did see significant economic growth, 3 to 4% GDP growth on a yearly basis for 20 years is really good. And it really shouldn't be downplayed. On the other hand, did they see really big gains in education, in individual, their individual way of living? Did it increase? Did they see that sort of benefit? Not so much. So yeah, I would say that the PRI is not created by rural people, but it's definitely created with rural people in mind, because that's where your electorate is. So let's see here. I am going to address some of Victoria's questions now. I'm so sorry I didn't notice you on Twitter before, honey, but I will get to you. So Victoria wants to know, what do I mean by demographic collapse? So a demographic collapse is where the population drops really, really rapidly. In the context of Mexican political history, we are then talking about the American demographic collapse after colonial contact. So following the Columbian exchange of pathogens and all sorts of things like, smallpox and the flu and rhinovirus and basically everything in the world, you see the overall population of the Americas decline by anywhere between 80 and 95% over the first 150 years after 1492. So that is the demographic collapse. It's mostly important in this context because it results in the use of labor systems like the encomienda, as well as eventually in some parts of Latin America, and to an extent in Mexico, enslavement of people from Africa. But Mexico didn't have a lot of the same sort of plantation style agriculture that much of the rest of Latin America did. They didn't really grow cane there. There wasn't so much in the way of rice production, which was some of the early stuff that was being done with regards to plantation agriculture. They did try to use some enslaved African labor up in the north in the silver mines, but that didn't work real well. People ran away. who can blame him? It was really terrible work. Let's see here. So yeah, Victoria, what's your next question? Who is Benito Juarez and why does he matter? Benito Juarez is only one of my favorite people ever. So Benito Juarez was a Zapotec Indian. He was from Oaxaca, and that's in the south. It's south of Mexico City. It's one of the heavily indigenous areas. And he was kind of brilliant. His family was super, super poor, and he wound up working for the local priest. And he taught himself Spanish in like 6 weeks. And the priest was like, oh my gosh, we have a genius here. And so he managed to get the boy sort of an apprenticeship and some scholarships. And ultimately, he went off to law school. Benito Juarez came back. He was a lawyer. And you'd think he'd be like really well disposed to the church because of all of that, but he really wasn't. He thought it was deeply unfair that he had to go through the church in order to get an education. He felt like that wasn't the way to do things. So as a lawyer and then eventually a judge and then eventually president 3 times, he passed a lot of laws that were really big on sort of separation of church and state, secular education, sort of rational scientific, educational philosophy, big on anti-clerical positions. He also didn't like property ownership very much. He was indigenous. He had a really hard time with the notion of property ownership in general, and thought that really land should be much more communal. And he passed something called the Juarez Law, which I talked about earlier because I was confusing it with something else. And the Juarez Law basically stated that all Mexican citizens are equal before the law, which is a really, really critical notion, especially in a place that, with the Sistema de Castas had different categories in terms of what people could do and own for a very long time on the basis of race or ethnicity. So yeah, Benito Juarez, super cool. Ultimately, however, he's not beloved by the church. There's something called the Reform Wars, which, as you can guess, are about his reforms. Very conservative members of society kind of join with the church, and they try to overthrow him. He goes into exile for a little while. During the chaos, the French decide in 1861 that they are going to invade because why not? So they invade, and then Napoleon III over in France finds a Habsburg from over in Austria, brings him over, puts him on the throne, says, hey, Maximilian, now guess what? You're Emperor of Mexico. And Benito Juarez is like, no. And then they fight. And I mean, not personally, but their armies fight. And then ultimately, the Mexicans defeat the French at the Battle of Puebla. And thus we have Cinco de Mayo. Yeah, that's the story. Okay. Let's see here. I would say, so why does he matter? He matters because he's an expression of anti-clericalism. He's an expression of sort of like the 2 notions of what the state should be in Mexico, this sort of like scientific, rational, sort of almost like progressive era. I mean, that's really what we're looking at, sort of progressive era notion about scientific rationalism in the state versus sort of a almost traditional feudal model with a heavy reliance on the Catholic Church for order and structure. Let's see here. Victoria also wants to know if I could please go over the Federal Electoral Institution. So the Federal Electoral Institution was created in 1996 under the presidency of, this has been driving me nuts. I can't remember who the president was during that term. So let me look it up. I'm sorry. Like, it has been driving me insane, and I just cannot pull his name out of my head. And I don't know why. 1996, Mexico president. Zedillo, I'm a moron. Of course it's Zedillo. Okay, all right. So Ernesto Zedillo is president following Carlos Salinas' like disaster of a presidency. Salinas is the dude who stole the presidency with the whole thing where the computer systems went down. Se cayó el sistema. And as a result, Zedillo is the last of the pre-presidents, and he is basically fighting a losing battle and an outgoing tide. However, he does do certain things that are commendable. First of all, he tries to do with the Zapatista rebellion, doesn't work real well. He does, however, create the Federal Electoral Institution, which is important. It is an independent commission that deals with federal elections, and it is truly independent, and it has done a lot to modify electoral processes since the terrible one of 1988. And in a lot of ways, it is the reason why the election of 2000 was so incredibly clean in Mexico. So Zedillo does deserve some credit for that. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. Let me jump back over here. I think I have some other questions coming in on Remind. So hold off on some other questions there for me, Victoria, and I want to check in over here. All right, so Jordan, I want to get back to you. You wanted to know what the Constitucionistas were. So Constitucionistas, based on the name, hopefully you can figure out, has something to do with the Mexican Constitution. So during the Mexican Revolution, there are basically three major factions, okay? I mean, basically, there's a lot more, but we're just going to go with three because it's easier, okay? All right, so there are three basic factions. Like, you guys know it kills me to like simplify this one, right? So there's three basic factions to the Mexican Revolution. There's the Constitucionistas, who are mostly sort of liberal moderates. Think 19th century liberalism. They're in favor of increased voter rights for men who probably are white and own a little bit of property. So they're not like increased voter rights for everybody. They're like increased voter rights for people who we like. And definitely not women, because women won't get the right to vote in Mexico until 1956, okay? But regardless, so at any rate, the Constitucionistas are sort of these well-educated, relatively young liberal elites living in the cities, most particularly Mexico City. And these are, you know, Victoriano Huerta, I'm trying to think, Francisco Maduro counts as a Constitucionista, even though he dies eventually, Obregón, a couple of other ones. And these are Venustian de Carranza, that's another one. And they are the fellows who wind up ultimately winning the Mexican Revolution. They're the ones who draft the Constitution in 1917. That's why they're called the Constitucionistas. The other two major branches in the Mexican Revolution, the people who were fighting against the state, are the Villistas up in the north and the Zapatistas down in the south. Remember, there are two types of Zapatistas. You have the Zapatistas with the revolution in 1910 to 1920, and then you have the Ejército Zapatista de la Liberación Nacional, right? Like the National Army of the National Zapatista Army of Liberation, right? National Liberation, whatever. Those words in some order. And those are established in 1994, and they're basically calling themselves Zapatistas in honor of Emiliano Zapata and the Mexican Revolution. So like those two things are connected. Okay, let's see here. Victoria, here, let me kind of go back over this. Victoria wants to know what I mean by machismo. Oh, that's a good question, honey. Okay, so machismo is like hypermasculinity, and it is a thing in Mexico. It's sort of like performative masculinity in a lot of ways. One might say toxic, depending on how one feels about it. But generally speaking, there is the notion in Mexico that masculinity is kind of to be performed. It is very public. It is all about sort of like the tough guy attitude, and it is sort of the public persona of men. And that can be a real problem because it can very often result in a significant amount of violence. They do have problems with alcohol consumption in Mexico. There is a notion of sort of the denigration of the role of women in public life. If you go to Mexico, if you go to many places in Latin America, this is not just unique to Mexico. And frankly, it's not unique here either. If you go places and you're female and you're walking the streets, it is not unusual to be catcalled. It's not unusual to be approached, being groped on public spaces. That's kind of normal. It's not okay, but it's kind of normal. And as a result, there have been a lot of problems and sort of pushbacks in recent years, especially with the increase in female politicians, which is a positive thing, I tend to think, about sort of the degree to which machismo in public life in Mexico makes it difficult for women to participate openly. There is a high degree of female victims of homicide in Mexico, and it can be tied to that, especially people who unfortunately work up in maquiladores, that sort of stuff. So there is, if you look at their demographic pyramid, you will notice that there are fewer women than there are men. It's not a massive gender imbalance, but it's there. And it tends to be a bit of a problem. So that's one thing I would bring up there. Victoria, I think I've already gone over the relevance of the Iranian Revolution. So make sure you go back and watch. I think it might be like the second or third term I discuss on this. And then your last comment, hang on a second, let me double check and make sure I don't have anybody else coming in here on Remind. I'm getting down to kind of the end of my questions, guys. So you guys have asked a lot of really good ones, and I do appreciate it. But if you have other ones, do make sure that you have asked them, because otherwise I'm going to have to move on in a minute. Yeah. I'm just checking. Why is it's showing that I have an unread message, but I can't find where it is. Okay. Oh, Abby, yay. Okay, excellent. So Abby has a question on the live chat, and I'll get to you in just a second, honey. And no, I haven't answered that one yet, so I'll get to it in a moment, okay? All right, so let's see here. Victoria wanted to know what is GATT, G-A-T-T, and why is it important? So in the 1990s, as a result of its economic restructuring, Mexico really started to kind of like pull back its protectionist economic policies, and instead it started to emphasize a lot more neoliberal trade policies, and that included participation in free trade zones. So the GATT is the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, and essentially what it is it is an international agreement whereby countries will try to pull back their tariffs. It's not free trade, it's essentially like everybody kind of make some basic agreements on certain goods with regards to the degree to which they will have tariffs. And then you have NAFTA, which is the big boy. That one's the one that matters probably more than anything else for Mexico. And that one basically eliminates almost all tariffs and protectionist measures on agricultural and most industrial goods coming from Mexico, Canada, and the United States in 1994. So hopefully that helps you out there. Victoria, I think I've gotten to all of your questions on Twitter now. If anybody else has questions on Twitter, I'm not seeing them. But let me go ahead and get to Abby's. Abby wants to know if I can summarize the caste war of the Yucatan. So don't worry, honey, you are perfectly fine. I haven't gotten to it yet. So the caste war of the Yucatan is, okay, it is one of the major destabilizing forces that that makes Mexico so deeply problematic throughout the 19th century. So basically, the caste war of the Yucatan goes from like, I might get the beginning date on this incorrect, so I do apologize. I think it's like 1854 up to like 1901. It's almost 50 years. Now, it is not constant fighting, but basically, what you can see throughout the 19th century in Mexico is the failure of the state to actually own the state. Even though I really love Benito Juarez, he really doesn't own the state, not in any significant way. Because in 1936, Mexico loses Texas. In 1948, 47, 48, they lose the Mexican-American War and therefore lose New Mexico and Arizona and California, Nevada, and basically everything north of the Rio Grande. And so as a result of this, the presidents that exist in the second half of the 19th century are really just trying to kind of control things. And that's why Porfirio Diaz is able to create the Porfiriato during the 1870s up until like 1910. And it's because of this fear of losing control of the state. Now, the one thing that goes on all during that is the caste war of the Yucatan. So it's called the caste war because it's really about the legal rights of indigenous people in the Yucatan. It's very complicated, but essentially in a lot of ways it has a lot of similarities to the Zapatista rebellion at present. You had people who were indigenous who lived in the Yucatan. It's a pretty tough place to live. Water is, we've already talked about this, but I mean, not today, but like in general. Water is hard to come by in the Yucatan, which sounds really counterintuitive because it's a rainforest area. But there aren't a lot of permanent rivers, so people get their water out of cenotes and things like that. So you can have water instability problems. Land is not really very rich in terms of its agricultural production. The ground's mostly limestone, so that's not the most nutritious of soils. Plus, it's a rainforest, so what nutrients there are leached out by the trees. People there traditionally do a lot of slash and burn agriculture, which is just something that's dated back to about 200 BCE. And as a result, this is kind of a rough place to live. It can be very mountainous and very, very, very dense jungle. And it is an area that the state therefore kind of ignores because it's hard to get to, it's hard to provide resources for, and it didn't really provide much interesting things that the 19th century Mexican state was after. So what you had was occasionally when the state would try to exert control over these areas that had really previously had poor state penetration, indigenous communities disliked it. First of all, they resented the fact that if they had to be part of the Mexican nation, that they didn't see the same sort of benefits to the Mexican nation that other places did. So they didn't see roads, they didn't see electricity in the same sort of way that the North did. And yet they were expected to pay taxes and all sorts of things like that. They also saw a disproportionate amount of military presence and a lot of exploitation at the hands of the church and also other institutions. And because of that, ultimately in 1854, I'm pretty sure it was, there were rebellions that broke out in the Yucatan against the state. And then they just kind of would pop up and die down and pop up and die down for about 50 years. And it basically made the Yucatan an area that the state couldn't really fully control. So it was an expression of state weakness. That's really all I would go for, a lack of state autonomy and capacity. Okay. Now, let's see here. Are there any other questions anybody has? We've gone for nearly an hour without me having to cajole you into coming up with anything, so that's good. Usually it's not that easy. Okay. I'm not seeing any other questions right now. Let me check Twitter again, just to make sure. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to send them to me right now. Otherwise, oh, I skipped that one. Okay, yeah, we'll do that one. All right. Victoria, I'm sorry, I skipped. Is there anything more than what we got in the notes that we need to know about the EZLN and or the Zapatista uprising? Not so much in the notes, but I would make sure that you have read that Harvey article and understood it, okay? I got the impression from some of your classes that your reading of it wasn't very deep and that you didn't really know what you were talking about, yeah? Some of the classes did a better job than others. 2A, I'm just going to throw out there. You guys kicked butt on that particular discussion. Nice job. But just in general, with regards to the Zapatistas, I would make sure that you understand the tie between, say, the economic collapse of the 1980s, the removal of Article 27, the signing of NAFTA, and the resulting the resulting uprising. I would also make sure that you're aware of the fact that, number one, it's still going on, that the Zapatistas do not want to really engage with the state. They are not interested in engaging with the state. They're interested in being their own thing. They also don't want to control the state. So it's not really a revolution. Remember, revolutions have to engage the entirety of the state. So it can't be a revolution if it's only one place. It's not even really a secessionist movement because they just want to do their own thing. They're not even interested in creating a state. I would look at that. I would also think, how does globalization perhaps benefit the Zapatistas as much as they dislike it? So those would be two tensions I would definitely look at with regards to that. Not seeing anything else coming in via Twitter. And I'm not seeing anything else come in via that, and not on live chat either. All right, guys. So we've gone for basically a full hour. So I hope this was useful. If not, feel free to ask me questions tomorrow. Remember, we will have quiz corrections before school and after school tomorrow. So you can always ask me questions then. Test is on Tuesday. I'm trying to think, should I give you a hint on the FRQ as a benefit for having watched this? Possibly. Give me a second. Let's see here. What can I throw your direction? Now, if I do this, here's the rule, guys. You are not allowed to send this out on a group chat. The only thing you can do is tell them to watch. Okay? That's how we're playing this. Maybe I will. Maybe I won't. I gotta figure this out. Yeah, that's what we're going to do. Here's what you need to think about with regards to your FRQ coming up on Tuesday. What I want you to be able to do is think comparatively about ethnic conflict throughout the class and how the state responds to it, okay? Ethnic conflict and how the state responds to it, and you better think comparatively, all right? This is not going to be a softball like last time, okay? So that's your hint, all right? That having been said, have a good evening, get some rest. I hope you had fun at prom. Don't forget, if you need to register to vote, there are resources on the blog, okay? All right, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye.